Wouldn't it be nice if all our children were guaranteed a job once they ended their education? It sounds like a good idea. But my guest today is want to discuss the fact that maybe there's something different about this from school to work that we should all know about. I'd like to welcome to my show Carolyn Stankie and Joan Wansley. And I want to begin a brief introduction of both. Joan, basically, you worked on the task committee, the education task committee for Senator Haynes, is that correct?
That's right.
And Representative Baldwin. Also, Carolyn, you worked with her in that regard, too. And the organization you're both part of is that Parents Involved with Education, right? And lobbyists up in Washington at this time. And recently you went to Washington, D.C. Maybe one of the two would like to elaborate as to why you're calling to Washington, D.C. and just recently and for such a short time.
Well, we went to Washington in June because right now the federal government is pouring out millions of dollars of funding for education and for different things that are coming down into our states. And because we are so totally opposed to the Goals 2000 and to all the funding that's coming into our states that controls what goes on in the classroom, we felt it absolutely essential to go to Washington, D.C. and hold a press conference to support our congressmen who have introduced a piece of legislation, 1883, called Back to Basics. And the purpose of our press conference was to call a halt to the Goals 2000, which is in legislation H.R. 6, and to call for the dismantling of the Department of Education and to send the money home to the states where it belongs with no strings attached.
So in other words, the states would have more autonomy and control over their education. Is that correct, basically?
Basically, we have a much better playing field to battle with the things that are going on in our state if the federal government isn't pouring dollars into the classroom. We could take it on state by state rather than having to deal with everything coming down from the federal level.
And did you want to add anything?
Well, what we're hearing a lot about is this consolidation of different departments, federal agencies and so forth. But what concerns me is that I'm not seeing enough in the legislation that eliminates those programs. In fact, what we're seeing more of are more federal agencies being set up under the Goals 2000 blueprint. Now, Goals 2000 legislation alone is not our only problem. It is kind of a blueprint. And so there are many components to that. For instance, the federal school to work is a part of Goals 2000. It's part of that blueprint. So what has happened with these people like Mark Tucker from the National Center on Education and the Economy, who are pretty much driving reform, and I want to say societal reform, because it's not just education reform, it's economic reform, it's restructuring our government, is that it's being implemented by introducing legislation in Congress, many pieces of legislation, then also on the state level, pieces of legislation. So it's been very difficult for us. We might eliminate one program, but we've still got 100 others that we have to try to eliminate the whole blueprint. It's been a tough job.
So you're trying to, basically, they seem to be in lockstep together. Is that what I understand it, both federal and state quite often? Well,
that's right. What happens, even the National Center for Education and the Economy states that they draft legislation, and then, you know, they shop it around and they find congressmen or assembly or senators to carry that legislation for them. And often, what their real plan is buried in hundreds of pages of legislation. And so many of our well-meaning congressional, even conservative congressmen are carrying this legislation without really understanding what's in that legislation.
Now, I guess maybe we get into it, for example, I mentioned apprenticeships. Now, on its base, of course, the word sounds very nice, and the partnerships of businesses and schools, and it sounds like something that would be very advantageous. Can you explain what would be the detriment and what would be the problem with that?
Let me explain.
Sure.
Let's back up for a minute. First of all, Joan is really an expert when it comes to implementation of a school-to-work program in states, because she sat on the state task force for the school-to-work for California. And doing our investigations, California is really the pilot for the nation on the school, they call it school to career. The school to career program. More federal dollars, more state dollars have been allocated to devise this program, this apprenticeship program, than any other place in the nation. And that's where Joan and I have come to realize that the head of this monster that we've been fighting called education reform is totally finalized when we implement the school to career legislation. And when we were back in Washington last week, a piece of legislation that our Republican good guys are carrying, like Joan was talking about, a piece of legislation they said would downsize big government, send the money home in block grants, and let us deal with our children in voc ed. And we thought, well, it sounds wonderful, and Joan and I read it, and we were absolutely floored, because what it was this. This is the Human Resource Development for the United States. It is the Clintons' plan to restructure America, society and government. And here it is spelled out line for line, word for word, what they plan on doing to this precious country of ours, and I call it treason. And our good guys are carrying this piece of legislation thinking they're doing a good thing, and they don't even know what's in it.
What this plan suggests is merging the Departments of Labor and Education.
Right. It seems like it would downsize.
We've been hearing quite a bit about downsizing.
Right.
In fact, what it's doing is centralizing, would be the more correct term for what's happening. Also talking about an interagency group, which also brings in HHS, Health and Human Services. So now you can see where there's an interagency collaboration to where all of this information is being exchanged between one and another. What this plan suggests doing is setting up a labor market information system. Where you keep hearing Gore talk about the information superhighway,
right.
That's the labor market information system. And what they want to do is make it law that all public and private industry report any job openings to the federal government. They're also suggesting well, what they want to do is set up a national skills standard board. And so that the diploma no longer will have any relevance for us. It will be obtaining certificates of mastery, initial mastery and advanced mastery. The certificates include personal skills such as conflict resolution and certain attitudes and behaviors.
Social skills.
Yes, and already in Oregon there was legislation that was passed there. The original legislation, House Bill 3565, the legislation said that employers would be penalized, or there'd be sanctions against employers who hired students who didn't have these certificates.
You couldn't hire who you want?
That's exactly right. So what you see is that not only will all private industry have to report job openings, but they won't be able to hire anyone unless they've been back through the system and obtained a certificate.
Sounds like more bureaucracy.
Well, it's total control over the economy, because they're talking about setting wages, about putting apprenticeships together, which there's nothing wrong with apprenticeship. Apprenticeship, but when you have a federal agency that is going to be controlling what the standards are, that's what's happening with this. That's frightening to me. They've got the nation set up in regions, and they will have workforce development boards set up in each region who are ultimately accountable to the National Skills Standard Board. So it's more federal bureaucracy, more control.
Yeah, that does not sound like it's eliminating anything. That's why I thought it was eliminating something from when I first heard that. They're joining the labor and the education. It sounds like they're downsizing it, but that's not the case.
That's not the case. In fact, that's why it's so hard to listen to the language and believe what you're hearing, and a lot of times the words are those that we would like to hear.
But they're
not. For instance, I'll give you a good case in point. Recently here, there was a task force put together for the School to Career Framework here in the state of California. And what they were doing, they were working off of a working draft. We sent some of our PI chapter leaders there to monitor the situation, because that was when Carolyn and I were in Washington, D.C. And they had working draft papers, and they were deciding about how they were going to set this framework up. And they said, well, if we use that word, then that's going to raise red flags. So we have to use a different word that sounds better. And so this was all, in a public hearing. Our chapter directors asked to see the working draft. They were refused. Then an aide from Senator Bill Leonard's office overheard that, went back to the senator's office and said, we want to see the working drafts of this framework, because this is a public meeting. And our superintendent, Delaney Easton, refused again. And he said, why is this shrouded in secrecy? But the most frightening part of all of this was a statement that was made by a gentleman by the name of Renwick during this task force meeting. Okay. And here's what he said. He said, by design, we're doing social engineering. We're using education to consciously invent the future of our culture and society. Let's get to it and acknowledge what we're doing. Mr. Renwick also stated that Hitler's Nazis gave social engineering a bad name and implied that if good people were the engineers, then social engineering would be acceptable. Now, Senator Leonard is just aghast. He said not one person on that framework, on that task force, even objected to those statements.
Not at all?
Not at all. So, in fact, it comes right out of their mouths that is what's taking place today. And that was much of what I experienced when I was on the School to Career Task Force. The Governor Wilson's had appointed Senator Haynes, and I went as his representative. And I want to tell you, there was no parent representation there at all, but with the exception, I think, with the PTA, and they called that parent representation.
But that's parents and teachers, though.
Well, they've become nothing more than a lobbying arm for the teachers' union.
Right. Okay.
And now that follows at the federal level, because in this document by Mark Tucker to the National Alliance for Restructuring in Education, he's, by the way, director for the National Center on Education and the Economy, in the plan, which we see being implemented in California in School to Career and states all over, it says specifically that this plan will require a change in the prevailing culture, in the attitudes, in the values, in the norms, and the accepted ways of doing things that define the environment. We will know that we have succeeded when we have enough transformed schools and their approach to education that sets norms, frames attitudes, that's of yours and my children,
right,
and defines the accepted ways of doing things in that part of the world, and there will be no turning back. That's a pretty emphatic statement to verify they are monkeying with our values.
Additionally, the same gentleman wrote a letter to Hillary Clinton, and he congratulated her on her win to the presidential office. I always thought there was some kind of identity confusion there, but anyway, he is congratulating her on that, and I've got a letter also here with addressing that and saying, now that you've been elected to office, it's time for us to get on with this plan. And he said, here's how you can advance, and I'm quoting, the agenda which you and I and we have all been working on, a practical plan. The plan comes from a group closely associated with the National Center on Education and the Economy. And by the way, Mark Tucker used to be on Carnegie Center for Education and the Economy. And he said, we need to have an American system for human resource development, and almost all of the current components of which were put into place before World War II. And so he's saying, oh, now that you're in office, now we can finally implement this and complete this, all of this new system that's been put in place before World War II. And that comes right from these are the chief advisors to the Clintons on education and the economy.
Right. Now, I guess to get more concrete and get down to exactly what this is, you have listed some questions I was just glancing over. It says they're going to be in kindergarten. They're going to start giving children ideas to what career they're going to be in. Can you explain, what do you mean by that? At that young an age, you're going to start steering children? Is that what I'm understanding?
Can I show you a chart here? This is from our California School to Career Framework.
Okay.
And here at the very bottom, in K through 5, children will now, in their curriculum framework, become aware of careers. So as early as kindergarten, they're going to start them on career thinking in curriculum.
The real term should be labor.
Yes.
Okay.
Then by grade 6 through 8, they will be exploring career paths. And so, you know, so much for basic skills. I don't know where that's going to fit into this, because now all the curriculum, especially in the legislation, we see it, is now going to be integrating the concepts of having a job and career. Then it goes on, our children now by the 9th and 10th grade will be selecting a career pathway for the rest of their life.
By 9th grade.
By 9th grade. But what's really concerning is, do you know our children will be graduating by the 10th grade?
10th grade?
10th grade. You know, we always wondered why the class testing that was supposed to be testing for students that were going to be the first in the world of math and science, why they only tested to the 10th grade. We could never understand why it didn't test in the 11th grade and the 12th grade. Those are the important grades to see where they're at. Well, it's because they're going to be graduating them and into the workforce by 10th grade.
Only 16 years old then.
Well, but let me tell you something about 16 years old. In the legislation, they are now being emancipated to an adult status at age 16. And as a parent, frankly, I don't approve of that one bit. I mean, if there's ever a time parents need control over their children, it's when they turn 16, not to have them say, I'm sorry, you can't tell me what to do. I'm an adult now.
Now, some people might say, for example, well, what would be the problem showing children about different careers that they could be interested in, for example, being a doctor or a lawyer and so forth? And how would you answer them in that context?
Yeah, let me just tell you how it practically works out on the local level. In North High School in Riverside, they have set up what they call a career, one-stop shopping career center. And that's part of what this legislation does and what the National Center on Education and Economy suggests doing. Just like Goals 2000 put up one-stop shopping service centers for the dispenser to dispense all social services there too. So you see the school site's becoming more than just a place to have education. It's also becoming a training laboratory. It's also becoming a place where you can get your medical care taken care of, and you know, if you need welfare or any of those things. That's what the school site's being used as now. One-stop shopping service centers, they call them. In Riverside, they have a Pathways program. It's a Career Pathways program. And by 9th grade, the student must choose a career. Now, what is concerning to us is that what is happening with those career pathways is there's a narrow amount of knowledge used for those students because they only learn what they need to know in order to perform a certain task in the labor market. You see. So civic,
for example, learning about your government, how it functions and so forth may not be.
That wouldn't be necessary to a career, say, if you were going into the medical field. Also, we're hearing an awful lot about, well, you know, we're in the new age of technology, so it's not necessary. They're saying, let's move away from this rote memorization of math facts and concepts and so forth, since we need we're using computers and calculators. So in other words, all those kinds of basic skills are not being taught. What you and I know as basic skills or basic knowledge is not being taught. Only the skills that are necessary in order to perform a certain task. So what it does is it narrows down your amount of knowledge you have. And there's a big difference between education and training. And what's happening to education now is they are going into the job of training rather than educating.
Is that how the businesses are becoming partners?
Yes.
I've heard there's a lot of business. And so at first it sounds on its face level, it sounds great, businesses want to help out. Right, but then what would be the detriment of it?
I'd kind of like to explain that if possible. Let's just take for an example now that for a child to go on to either go out and work or to go on to higher education, they have to get a SIM, a Certificate of Initial Mastery. So it's going to be that portable work card. And they're going to have to have that. Now, because education and post-secondary education is totally being revamped, nobody can get higher education. It's best we can deduce from what we've been reading without having or serving a 2 to 3 year apprenticeship program. Now, let's show you how the apprenticeship program works, because we have federal intervention here. The employer now goes to the school and says, okay, I'll take 10 apprentices. And the federal government says, I'm going to subsidize you, business, for paying half their wages. Now, the students are going to be working for less, from what we can tell, than minimum wage. Business is going to be enticed to do it because, number one, the federal government is paying half of the child's wage, plus they don't have to pay all of the typical workman's comp, benefits, insurance, and the child now has been emancipated to adult status so they can circumvent all the child labor laws, so their profit ratio is going to go up. Now we have a problem, just like Germany did, because Germany's plan is what we're doing.
Is that what they did, huh?
Yes, and we can prove that in documents. Bottom line, Germany has a very high unemployment rate, and we can tell you 12%. Why. Because
Yeah, they miscalculated the number of what they did was they set the number of labor market demands there would be, and so they said, well, we're going to need so many engineers, so many doctors, and so on and so forth. Well, they miscalculated, and it drove the unemployment rate up to 12%. So,
but even more than that, what happens is when a business is finished with the apprenticeship, now are they going to give that student a job with full pay, losing federal subsidy for their wages, having to pay them full benefits, or, because we're talking entry-level jobs here, or are they going to go back to the school, to the labor pool, and pull out some more kids? That's what happened in Germany. 51% of all the male students could not get a job in something they had been skilled for within a year, because business did precisely that. So we're in a catch-22. What happens? Either federal government makes a law saying you've got to now employ those students that you trained, which is not fair to business, or they go back and get cheap labor, and children are being sacrificed for slave wages and calling it education, and they'll never get a job for that because they're going to go back to the school and pull out more cheap labor, and unemployment is going to go sky high because you and I are going to be out of a job. And what was interesting in this legislation, 3 different places in this legislation, they talk about emergency disaster relief for plant closures and unemployment, and they talk about relocation, 48-hour federal funding to come in and help out because there are going to be so many people without a job.
So they have to relocate.
So they have to relocate.
Oh, geez.
this is a document put out by the U.S. Department of Education, and in it is an article that was published in the Washington Post with regard to Clinton's plan, and it clearly states here that they are looking to Germany at their education program there, and in fact the main office that they consult with is located in Germany, and they brought in a Werner Franz from the Home Office in Germany here to the United States to help us with changing education.
But it's not working over there, is that correct?
Well, it's not working there, but furthermore, why do we need the German, or really it's the whole European system, where, you know, we're in a country that's been innovative. We've been on the front runners in almost everything we've ever done.
Right.
This is socialism. Why do we want socialism? And in the United States, it hasn't worked anywhere else. It's a proven failure.
Now, I guess my next question would be, how does this create a system of classification? You mentioned that in this brief article too. Well, what do you mean by system of classification?
Well, again, my mother and father happen to be from England, and they've been using this type of a system for quite a long time. And what would happen is by 10th grade, as we said, they will graduate or they get their certificates, and they're funneled directly into the labor market. But who usually ends up on that system are the lower class or the working poor. My mother told me, she said, Joan, there was never any chance of any of us that came from that lower class of ever going on to higher education because we didn't have the money for it. You had to be able to afford to put your children into that. And that's the problem. It is a system of classification. That the whole idea with this is that they're being directly funneled into the workforce at 16 years of age without really very much of an opportunity ever of going on to higher education.
So they don't have much of a liberal arts background, is what I mean. They're very narrow with their emphasis.
Exactly.
I'd like to describe what happens, because now if children are going to go into apprenticeships, what's available to them? Because now this is not just getting a job. This is called the stepping stones to higher education. So they're going to have to work. Now, say at 16 they go out, and we've got a young man who has the capabilities of being an aerospace engineer, but because he is in a geographical working zone that is more hotel-motel or agriculture like our Coachella Valley, are they going to put that child on a bus and ship him 5 hours to Canoga Park,
No.
where he's going to be able to work in aerospace? No.
That's the regionalization I was
That's
talking
the
about.
serious problem.
So if you have skills in other areas, you're pretty much locked in anyway.
Exactly.
And in Oregon, tell them what the state senator said to you, Joan, about Oregon.
Yeah, Senator Marilyn Shannon was interviewing the state superintendent and said, well, now what are the kids going to do that are out in these rural areas if they want to get a medical degree? And they said, well, I guess we're going to have to bus them into Portland in order to do so this is, you can see the cost involved, and it's not a well thought out plan.
That's a lot of money.
Yes, you bet it is.
Are they talking about
right.
relocating our children? That's another question
That's
we
right.
wonder.
Yes,
Oh, so yeah, this whole idea from school to work then, has this been based upon anything in the past that has been, I mean, that's a good question, because what have they decided? This doesn't come from nothing de novo. It's something that must have been based on some research.
Well, they've done research. The Federal Department of Education, the National Center for Research and Voc Ed, was granted $4 million to the University of Berkeley to study the Soviet polytechnical vocational ed.
Oh, so Soviet Union.
And what they say is, it is one of the leading efforts to establish a school in which there is what in English writing on education is termed parity of esteem. Marxist-Leninist ideology is rooted in the polytechnical education, which remains a powerful influence.
We can't see
In our
any
market.
difference between this and...
So that's where the... But I thought that failed over in Russia, from what
I
you said.
thought it did too,
I mean,
but
from
that's
what
what
we
we're
heard.
on fast track. And let me show you, this is very interesting. For anyone out there who wants any of this information, please contact us at PI. We have, and this is the Soviet polytechnical ed translated from the Russian into English, and it is the comparison of what we've implemented in frameworks and in legislation versus the Russian in red, and it's practically identical. Some of the wording is even the same.
Now, no one's ever... I guess we're running low in time now, but we're going to have a second show, but I have some more questions I want to ask because I'm interested to know. This is very new to myself. I'm glad we've had an opportunity having to show the first one. Thanks, Carolyn.
Thank you, John.
And thank you very much, Joan.
Thanks.
Are children going to be employed after they end their education? Or will they be unemployed, as in Germany, as has been stated? And is this program really going to benefit us? I think we need to take the time to do our own research and find out. Thank you. Nice of our children when they graduate, they all would have a job. They know that they'd have a sense of security and something they could build on. Sounds like a great idea, and my guests are going to talk about this and what is the reality about what's being proposed today in our education system. I'd like to welcome back again Carolyn Stankie and Joan Wansley. You're from Carolyn. Basically, she is the president of PI, Parents Involved in Education, and Joan is the lobbyist for parents involved in education up in Sacramento, if that's correct, right? Now, lately, the organization has went national.
Yes, we have.
And you two both worked on the education task force for both Senator Haynes and Congressman, Assemblyman
Steve Baldwin.
Steve Baldwin, sorry about that, yeah. Anyway, let's begin where we left off, basically, if you wanted to tell me some of the new legislation, which you're going to mention in regards to from school to work and the careers.
Right. You know, we all want our children to have a good education so that they can go out and get the job of their desire and have the foundation skills necessary to have some choices. And Joan and I, who've been very involved in education reform, have come to the conclusion that all of the things that we've been fighting have been like tentacles on an octopus. And the head of the octopus really and truly is the school to career implementation plan. We are very concerned about what we see happening because it is not just children learning and getting a job. The plan as we see it, that has been spelled out in specifics, is truly a restructuring of our American culture and our government. And it has even become a states' rights issue, and that's what I want to talk today about, because it lies within this piece of legislation. I call it a wolf in sheep's clothing. It's House Bill 1617, and I'm so sorry to say some of our really good Republican guys, not knowing what's in this bill but believing what they're being told it is, have bought it hook, line, and sinker. And so both Joan and I are very involved right now in trying to get a halt put to this thing and to bring public attention so we can have grassroots uprising to stop, because this will absolutely destroy America. I call it, will we have America with our flag flying, or will this be America with the hammer and the sickle, because that's what's at stake. And I just want to tell you in some brief sound bites what's in this piece of legislation.
Sure.
First of all, as a mother, I found that children age 16 are going to be graduating into the workforce and calling it education, and they're going to also be emancipated to an adult status. Now that troubles me, because no child that I know 16 years of age does not need the oversight of their parents. And that's what this bill will do. It will set them free at age 16. If this were an honorable bill, and we're truly setting up a plan that will benefit children in society, then why does it totally circumvent states' rights and put the plan, the implementation of the plan, and the funding that it takes to bring this plan about into the hands of one man in the states, the governors, where it literally in the legislation lines out state legislatures. They have no say, no oversight, or no one is accountable for this. It is a merger. It is a mega merger.
The governor and the states?
The governor is the only
huh?
person who has the supreme authority over this piece of legislation being implemented.
See, that doesn't make sense. Yeah.
It certainly doesn't, and it's got a lot of our state legislators absolutely up in arms. And there's going to be a showdown on it. Now, let me just tell you what else. This piece of legislation is setting up, and Joan will be talking about it, an all-encompassing database.
Now, how does that, because you had mentioned here, there's a brief flyer here, school to career. It mentions dossiers and psychological testing, and I guess most people would think the first reaction would be, oh, this is too much to the extremes. It doesn't seem like that's possible. They wouldn't create dossiers on the children or on anyone else.
Well, in fact, that's what it does. H.R. 1617 calls for what's called a labor market information system. That labor market information system will keep records on not only students, but on every worker in the United States. All of the standards are being set by a National Skill Standard Board. There will be labor workforce boards put into regions, as I told you before. Those are they will have the oversight over this new economic plan. The only person that they are accountable to then, even though the governor sets it up, but they have to account to the National Skills Standard Board. And by the way, that the secretary of that will be an appointed position appointed by the President of the United States. So we really have bypassed all of our elected representation,
So they can
with
do
the
nothing.
exception of the President and the Governor. That would be it. Now, what that does is this labor market information system, according to HR 1617, is where employers will report job openings. Now, we talked about the National Center for Education on the Economy, but they wanted to make it law that public and private sectors report all job openings to the federal government. All right. Now, remember, we're talking about certificates of initial mastery. Well, those are based on what are called portfolios, electronic portfolios that are kept on every student, but not only just every student, but every employee in the United States.
How do they manage that now?
Well, they're doing that by setting up databases, and that's what the labor market information system is a database where all of that information goes into that. And here in the state of California, for instance, now we have something called WorkLink that's in many other states. I have not got an exact read on how many states have it, but we have something that's very similar in nature. It's called VitalLink. It's in Orange County, but it's also in Texas. And VitalLink looks almost exactly like the SCANS sample resume. Now, SCANS is the Secretary's Commission on Achieving National Skills, and that, again, is that national skills I was talking about. Well, VitalLink, what it is doing is working through the industrial leagues and through the chambers of commerce. Interesting to note that the person who was the head of the School to Career Task Force also holds a very high position in the chambers of commerce, Thomas McKernan, here in this state. So the employability transcripts are kept on each student. It's a file. It's a transcript, or what I call a dossier, because it not only does it keep information on your academic achievements, but how many hours of community service you've done, whether you can get along with your fellow workers. It has career skills, which are called problem solving, conflict resolution, group participation, listening. A lot of personal qualities are being assessed along with that, and your punctuality. Now, this is a lifelong record. That's what we keep hearing about, lifelong learning and adult literacy, all of that, because this tracks you for life. It is a lifelong tracking. And then it's being put, what happens, the way they're setting this up is they're working through the chambers of commerce and the industrial leagues, as I said, to encourage the employers to go to the school to access these files, and that's through VitalLink. They're going to use the student's social security number. Now,
so that's why they're asking more students for their number? Is that
exactly right. And the social security number also, by the way, we have federal law that says it should be used for no other purpose other than just for the Social Security Administration. So that's illegal right there, just to even be using the social security number to access any kind of information. But again, here's the question. What about the student's privacy? The student will never have an opportunity to write his or her own resume, because the information is being kept by the employer and by the school and being put into these electronic portfolios. So here is a privacy issue, and that's real frightening to me.
So you mean from a young age, the children, anything that they've, like their work or their habits and so forth, their report cards?
It's the electronic portfolios that are being put on. The information is being collected at each school site, and I also am of the understanding that we have mobile units being set up at the school sites to collect this data.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's neat.
I'd like to read you. It's interesting. The work links, which is part of this VitalLink or work links, depending on what state it is, they're talking about, this is an advertisement to business on why they need to hook up with them and become part of the system. And they say that the more information you have about an applicant's real skills, the better are your hiring decisions and the less your employee turnover will be. Each WorkLink record saves you time and money on your recruitment efforts by providing, 1, a standard summary of a high school transcript, teachers' confidential ratings of a student's work-related behaviors.
Confidential?
And that is very troubling, because if you have a teacher 2 or 5 who don't like you, and they have access to these confidential teachers' evaluations. That's on your record for life.
It sounds like a lawsuit in the making, though. I mean, just the fact that they're accessing confidential information.
That's right, and it seems that the only people who aren't allowed to see this information are parents.
They're not allowed.
No, we've had many instances where parents have gone to the school site and asked to see the student records or their CUME files or their electronic portfolios. They've been denied access. They say it's private and confidential. However, an employer can access it, the government can access it, but the people whom those records and files are being kept cannot.
They have no access to their own files.
John, this might sound outrageous, but right here's the documentation that proves what they're storing on the child. California entered into an agreement for testing for the class test with CTB McGraw-Hill. We knew we had contracts with them. We knew how much the contract was for, but we never got the actual contracts. But in our investigations, we got the contracts CTB McGraw-Hill did with Indiana, with the state of Indiana. And one of the first things they talk about when they're talking about their capabilities as CTB McGraw-Hill, they say, due to the sensitive nature of some of the data that will be provided to the contractor understands that from time to time during its performance for the agency, the contractor will be required to work with information, data, and concepts that are confidential and sensitive in nature. And they go on to say how they will keep it totally privileged so that it will not get out. Mind you, that's data on the children, on their personal lives, on what's going on in their home. It is confidential, sensitive information, and CTB McGraw-Hill is keeping it. And then it talks about in here how they have set up a data highway with a retrieval system. Now all of a sudden that contradicts keeping it confidential, because if you have a retrieval system and there's sensitive confidential information, who can retrieve it? And then it goes on here to say, well, anyone who is aligned with them. Whoever is part of the system. So that includes, and it says in here in black and white, corporations. They have, at a moment's notice by fax modem, they have all the information on the child they need. So when that child comes to his employer with his best foot forward, his portfolio and all of his good work that he's put together to make a good presentation, before he ever walked in the door, they've hooked up to the school and gotten everything there is to know on that child.
Oh, so you can forget.
Yeah.
Oh, geez. Well, I guess another comment I want to make is they're talking about re-engineering of society. You make a comment here about womb to tomb. We've heard that mentioned before by our governor, Wilson. What does that entail, womb to tomb? You know, it sounds like they're going to be taking care of children in the young age and Head Start, and much of it sounds very grandiose and you know, helpful. But what do you see involved with it?
Well, it's interesting because remember I was talking about those one-stop shopping service centers, the dispenser of social services. Well, what we're seeing are a lot of child care centers being set up on campuses. For instance, in Santa Ana, we have one of those one-stop shopping service centers where Medi-Cal cards are being handed out to students, and they are being told that they can get their own medical care. Of course, they say that the parent has to approve it, but in reality, that's not what happens. So you have your school-based clinics are part of this plan as well. The re-engineering, what I'm talking about, and that's how Carolyn and I got involved in this, were the California Learning Assessment System, where there are assessments being made of students to determine whether they are at risk. And I believe that that's what the class tests were doing, because they weren't academic tests, and we took those class tests to various psychologists and so forth, and they confirmed that indeed they were psychological tests. One, to see whether the student had any problems at home, because they were asking for that kind of information on those tests. But also to see what the threshold of change is. In other words, they were given a very morbid, emotionally disturbing story to read, and then they wrote what they thought about it, broke off into groups, talked to other students about the story, and then they came back and wrote again about what they thought about that story. And you could see that there would be a definite change in attitude toward that story after having gotten into a peer situation. Well, now we have come to find out that that information was being gathered in order to determine how many at-risk students are at each school site, whereby there are monies coming through Medicaid
For at-risk?
for at-risk students.
Oh.
And so there's a mad rush now by school districts to label as many students as possible at risk because there's more dollars going onto the school site. And
That
in fact,
makes
they're
sense, yeah.
rewarded for having more at-risk students.
Right.
And we have the perfect scenario in our desert at Eisenhower School, which is a elementary school where they were applying for a Goals 2000 intervention grant, which would be coming down straight from the federal government through Health and Human Services. And it was for almost $500,000. And what they did in order to apply for the grant money is they surveyed the children in the classrooms of this school and came to the deduction that 70% of all those children in that school lived in highly dysfunctional families.
That's right. And so HR 1617 talks about an Institute for Family Literacy. And on these one-stop shopping service centers, now we're seeing a lot of parent education centers popping up. So the whole idea is, and even this legislation says, that we're going to retrain parents how to be parents. So what they're doing is they're setting up this Institute for Family Literacy, and that is one of the things that are going to be required as part of getting these certificates, is to demonstrate that you're being a parent who's involved with helping your child with their homework, that you're involved at the school site, that you're reading to them every night. We're talking about the federal government monitoring the home environment to be assured that the parent is doing their job. I'd call that.
Is it not, it's not, eventually, at first it comes across as being voluntary, am I correct? In some ways it sounds like, okay, we're going to help the parents, some of them are illiterate and so forth, and like I said, it gives the appearance, that's what I see. But then what you're trying to, maybe you can elaborate, the problem would be is that it's not necessarily going to be voluntary completely?
Well, we have a piece of legislation that is coming down the pike right now called the Parents Report Card. That's the accountability mechanism that says that you will be evaluated on your parenting skills of your child. And that information and that report card that the school gives on the parent, I don't know who determines it. Does the child make a decision? Does the teacher say if the parent is worthy or not? I have no idea. All I know is that by law, it says that information on a parent report card can be made available to other agencies. Are we talking about social services or child protective services? I have no idea. But let me just say one other thing. We have the federal law. Now, when you've got federal programs or federal money coming into a individual school, federal law applies. And under 42 CFR, they're talking about confidential information on my child. It says that no information that the core team working on my child who's been designated at risk can be shared with anyone outside of the group, and that's social services, counselors, teachers, what have you, unless they have expressed prior written consent from my child. I can't even know what they're doing with my child in the classroom.
So the child has to write permission?
Has to sign.
Yes. And parents are getting very upset. And as we are right now in California, and when we woke up January 1, 1995, we didn't have any parental rights to have a say in any curriculum, any testing, any questionnaires, any surveys that would be administered to our children that dealt in our personal family beliefs, practices on sex or family life or religion. We used to have that right to have a say. If we wanted our children to participate, we had to give them permission. Now they can do it whenever they want to, and we have no method to hold them accountable.
See, it's funny because very few people really know about this, or
That's
do they?
right. They don't know.
It doesn't make any sense.
Not too many people know, because all of those rights were stripped away when we had the restructuring legislation that came into the state of California. And much of this was introduced at the National Governors Conference. You see, if our governor really did not want an expansion of the welfare base, he could say no to these programs. That's where we really need to put pressure on as our governor, because much of this bypasses our legislature. In some cases it does, but sometimes it doesn't, and that's why you see the school to career frameworks and all the health frameworks, all of that's appointed by our governor, never went to the voting public, and of course parents never had any say in any of this.
Sounds unconstitutional.
It certainly does. But I think our governor really needs to know how we are perceiving this as a real violation of privacy and big brother intervention.
Now, what's the lifelong learners and acquire certificate participate for job makes them? Most people would think a lifelong learner, people want to be lifelong learners. You want to learn your whole life. But, you know, the phrase sounds very good.
Right.
What's the real issue
Well,
here?
that's back again to those certificates, that if you are going to get another job or you want to change careers, then you have to go back through the system again to get a certificate. The way it's looking...
You have to get a certificate in order to work at any...
That's the way it was introduced in Oregon. Now, there was enough objection there in Oregon that they took out the sanctions on employers for hiring students that didn't, or an adult that didn't have a certificate. But again, you know, there was that objection that time, but mark my words, it'll come back.
That's
what it always does.
Bronson always said it's back on the docket.
Back. And
now, may I just say one other thing? How this will happen overnight is with tremendous job layoffs, and we talked about it at the last show. In this piece of legislation, in 3 different areas, they talk about disaster relief for mass unemployment. They do.
So they're anticipating.
So they're anticipating it. We thought, boy, what do they know we don't know?
Probably
But
an economic crash.
And they're talking about anyone who has used up their benefits for unemployment, and within 8 weeks of being out of a job, they have to be enrolled in school to go back and get a SIM, a Certificate of Initial Mastery. So the adult population will be going back to school because they will not work without that portable work card if this legislation goes through.
Yeah, everybody's got to carry a work card?
Yeah, the work card is not in this legislation. I just want to clarify that. The portable work card?
Yes,
I
it
didn't
says
see it.
so.
I'm sorry.
It says portable work card.
Okay, all right then.
So it is in there.
So those are the cards.
The
I
portable
thought that's
work
what they
card
did.
is in here.
Didn't they do that in Germany in the 30s? I thought, isn't that what they had a work card for everyone?
That's right, yes. And you know what, like back again to what I really want to emphasize here is that with these employability transcripts or these certificates, there's a lot of emphasis on your behaviors and attitudes, and that's a real concern to me.
A level of satisfaction, they call it. That's
So they're going to be gauging how you're... Now, another issue is the bureaucracy. I mean, to me, it sounds like instead of downsizing, like we mentioned in the previous show, isn't this going to also create a larger bureaucracy? It's going to have to be handling all these different contingencies?
Oh, absolutely.
It's a whole new layer of bureaucracy.
I mean,
National
how are they
Skills
gonna
Standard
fund this?
Board,
I
New
don't-
Standards Project, Goals 2000, the National Goals Panel. We've got labor boards. We've got all kinds of a whole new layer of bureaucracy that's been set up, and they keep telling us, well, that's not our intent. We're trying to downsize. We want to eliminate the Department of Education. And I say, where's the legislation that's eliminating the Department of Education? You know, where is this? I mean, before we start something like this, let's get rid of those first.
There's nothing.
I don't see it. I don't see it. And I'm afraid that some of our Republicans are being sold down the creek with this. I really believe that that's what, in other words, like with the School to Career Task Force, we kept saying the language in here is extremely regulatory, that the workplaces have to conform to these work sites for the students to come to work on apprenticeship, and they're going to be regulated and everything. And they said to me, that's not our intent. And then I'd say, well, why don't you change the language in the plan to reflect your intent? And then I'd ask them about something else. They said, well, that's not our intent.
Oh, you better
but that's what you've got in the plan in black and white.
Right.
If that's not your intent, then rewrite it. But they wouldn't. So it's interesting to me how I constantly ask this question. They say, well, that's not our intent. But there's nothing done to change the language.
The world's been paved with good intentions.
Oh, yes.
so that we can understand when this is a monitoring of attitudes and beliefs, not just job skills. And it says so specifically they'll have to demonstrate certain outcomes. And it specifically said in the legislation a level of satisfaction. To the average person who doesn't know, that is a whole content domain for curriculum. As it says here, this is from their conceptual model of domains and outcomes from the National Center on Outcomes. They have physical health, responsibility and independence, contribution and citizenship, academic and functional literacy, that's the only thing academic in the whole plan. Also, personal and social adjustment and satisfaction, which has to do with your self-esteem.
Oh. And that's the government's rating that.
That's the government.
So they rate you in all those areas?
Yes.
And if you're rated a bad citizen because you don't agree with legislation,
or you don't agree with the politically correct attitude,
exactly.
You will not get a job or a
what,
certificate of initial mastery.
That's what's happening here.
That's what's happening here.
So much for freedom of speech.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. There's something called the Dangan file in China that's exactly the same thing. If there's any political expression that's the anti-government, then those people can't work.
That's right.
See, that doesn't make sense. Do you have any closing comments? We're running right towards the end of the program here, so if you would have something to say.
Well, I think by now I'm sure people are asking what can they do. You are going to put the address up for PI, and you can anyone can write for information on any of the subjects we touched on. We're fully documented. But the most important thing that we have to do with the governor is to tell him that we don't want the school to career program here in this state. We don't want to come under any federal mandates. Our state did apply for federal school to work funds, and also we have received Goals 2000 funds that was through our governor, and we need to let him know that we don't want social restructuring or social engineering here in this state. And also we need to write to our congressmen. Many of the congressmen are not aware of this program, and that would be the most important thing I could say to your listening audience that they can do to help us.
Well, thank you. And Carolyn, I hate to end on the note. I want to give you time, but we're running short here. Please take the time and do your own research and find out what you can so that you can become involved and make a difference. Thank you.